Welcome back to Crash Course. If you are watching my video, then close your eyes and relax. One request: if you like my video, please like and subscribe. Thank you. Let's start. Whispers of the Drowned House. The rain hit Blackwood with the ferocity of 1,000 storms. It wasn't the kind of rain you heard about in fairy tales, gentle, soft drops that lulled you to sleep. No, this was a deluge, a torrential downpour that soaked everything in its path, turning the roads into rivers and the streets into muddy, slippery mazes. But Jonathan Gray wasn't bothered by the weather. In fact, he preferred it. Jonathan was a journalist, the type of man who believed every legend had a kernel of truth, hidden beneath layers of myth. He had heard about the drowned house, the infamous abandoned mansion that loomed at the edge of Blackwood's dark forest. The house had been the subject of rumors for years. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it was haunted, and a few even whispered that it was alive. Jonathan was drawn to the mystery of it. His latest article was about urban legends, and nothing could be more fitting than this house. A perfect mix of horror and history. But as he made his way through the mist-covered woods towards the house, Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't the cold or the rain that caused it. No, it was something else. Something far deeper. The forest felt alive, as though the trees were watching him, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Finally, after what seemed like hours of walking, Jonathan reached the clearing, and there it stood, the drowned house. It was worse than he had imagined. The house was not just abandoned, it looked as though it had been forgotten by time itself. The windows were cracked, the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect, and vines crawled up the walls, claiming the structure like a living thing. But it was the statues that unsettled him the most. 3 figures stood at the entrance, half submerged in the mud and surrounded by overgrown weeds. They were humanoid, but not quite human. Their faces were distorted, caught in expressions of agony. Their eyes, however, were the most disturbing feature, wide and unblinking, staring directly at Jonathan, as if they could see right through him. He stood there, mesmerized for a moment, wondering if the stories were true. Could these statues really come to life, as some of the local legends suggested? Shaking his head, he pushed forward, stepping past the statues and up to the front door. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, groaning as if protesting his presence. The door was slightly ajar, and Jonathan's curiosity outweighed any sense of fear. He reached out and pushed it open. The house greeted him with a gust of musty air that reeked of decay. Inside, the floorboards creaked, as if the house itself was alive, groaning in response to his intrusion. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The hallway stretched out before him like a black void, but he pressed on. There was something here, something that needed to be uncovered. As he walked deeper into the house, Jonathan's flashlight illuminated faded wallpaper, peeling off the walls in places, and old furniture covered in a thick layer of dust. A sense of loneliness filled the air, yet it wasn't just an empty, abandoned house feeling. No, there was something far more sinister lurking in the corners. Suddenly, Jonathan heard it, a soft whisper, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Leave," it whispered again, faint, but clear. "Who's there?" Jonathan called out, his voice echoing through the empty house. There was no response. only the faint sound of dripping water from somewhere deep inside the house. He took a cautious step forward, his footsteps eerily loud in the silence. The whispers continued, this time growing louder, as if they were moving toward him. Then the sound of footsteps, real footsteps, came from upstairs. Jonathan swallowed hard. His first instinct was to turn and run, but the lure of the mystery was too strong. He wasn't about to leave now. Taking a deep breath, he began to ascend the stairs, the secrets of the drowned house. The second floor was even worse than the first. The air was thick, heavy with a dampness that clung to his skin, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. The hallway was narrow, and the doors to the rooms were cracked open, revealing glimpses of overturned furniture and remnants of a long-forgotten life. At the end of the hall, there was a single room with a door that seemed more solid than the others. The light that seeped from beneath the door was a faint red glow, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't know what was waiting for him behind that door, but he had to see it. With a trembling hand, he pushed the door open. The room was small, but unnervingly pristine. It was as if no one had touched it in years. Yet everything was in its place. A bed, a dresser, and on the bedside table, a dusty leather-bound journal. The room was otherwise bare, save for the strange red light that seemed to pulse from somewhere unseen. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he picked up the journal. It was old, its pages yellowed with age. He opened it to the first entry. My name is Amelia Leclerc. I am the daughter of William and Margaret Leclerc, and this is our home. But lately, it feels like something is wrong. Father is acting strange, as though he's being pulled by something, some force beyond his control. Mother doesn't leave her room. She says there is something out there in the woods, something watching us. The writing grew more frantic as Jonathan read further. Tonight, I saw it, a figure in the mirror. It wasn't me. It was something else. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like we're not alone anymore. I hear footsteps at night, but no one is there. Father says the house is alive. I think I believe him. Jonathan's eyes scanned the final entry, his pulse quickening. We've made a terrible mistake. We were warned. The house, it wants something from us. I don't know if we'll make it out alive. The chilling sense of dread that Jonathan had felt earlier was now a suffocating weight on his chest. Something was wrong in this house. The whispers, the red light, the journal, everything pointed to something dark, something ancient, lurking just beneath the surface. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. Jonathan spun around, his heart racing. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let him leave. The house awakens. Jonathan's heart pounded in his ears as he turned toward the now closed door. He rushed toward it, his mind racing with questions. How had it shut on its own? There was no one else in the room, and yet he could almost feel the weight of unseen eyes upon him. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. His hand trembled as he grasped the doorknob, but no matter how much he twisted, the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had decided to keep him there. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around him like a storm. You shouldn't have come. Jonathan's breath hitched, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop sharply. The red light that pulsed from the corner of the room intensified, casting an eerie glow over the journal on the bedside table. His eyes flicked back to the journal. Something about it felt off, as though it had been waiting for him. He grabbed the journal again, flipping through its pages. The entries became more frantic with each turn, speaking of something ancient, something that had been awakened. The final entry was a chilling account of Amelia's last moments in the house. The house. It has a heartbeat. I feel it in the walls, in the floor beneath my feet. We are not its masters. We are its prisoners. I cannot escape. If you find this, run. Don't come looking for me. It's too late. Jonathan's pulse quickened as a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He was beginning to understand. The house wasn't abandoned. It wasn't merely haunted. It was alive. It had fed on the souls of its residents, and now it was hungry again. The drowned ones suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the floor below. Jonathan's entire body tensed as a low growl filled the air. The whispers turned into frantic murmurs, almost as if the house itself was speaking to him. His mind raced as he grabbed the journal and hurried to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtains. The storm outside had reached a new level of ferocity. The rain lashed against the window like 1,000 tiny claws, but it wasn't just the rain. Jonathan's eyes widened as he saw figures moving through the downpour, their forms indistinct, but unmistakably human. Or at least, they had once been human. They were the drowned ones, figures from the town's oldest legends. Residents claimed that anyone who ventured too close to the house at night would see these figures. Some believed they were the souls of past victims, forever cursed to wander the earth, trapped in the murky depths of the house. The drowned ones stood motionless in the yard, their skin pale and bloated, their eyes glowing red as they stared up at Jonathan. The sense of dread grew more intense as they began to move, slowly and deliberately, toward the house. Jonathan could hear their wet footsteps as they trudged through the flooded yard, their bodies dripping with water, as if they had been submerged for years. The house groaned, and the walls shuddered. It was feeding. The souls of the drowned were being drawn back inside. Jonathan could feel it in his bones. The house was ready to claim him too. Escape is no option. Jonathan knew he had to escape. But how? The door was locked, the drowned ones were closing in, and the house itself seemed to be alive, waiting, watching, hungry. His mind raced for a solution, but everything felt hopeless. He turned back to the room, searching for something that could help. His eyes landed on a small, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. There was something different about it, something strange about the way it caught the light. Approaching cautiously, Jonathan studied the reflection. His own face stared back at him, but then something shifted in the mirror. The reflection of the room was different. It was darker, and in the corner, he saw a figure, a woman, pale and ghostly, her hair wet and hanging in front of her face. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. It was Amelia. He could see it now. The resemblance was unmistakable. The woman in the mirror reached out toward him, her hand pressing against the glass. Her lips parted, but instead of sound, only a chilling cold emanated from the mirror. "Help me," the voice whispered, barely audible, but unmistakably pleading. Without thinking, Jonathan stepped closer, pressing his hand against the mirror. The moment his fingers touched the glass, the entire room seemed to shift. The red light flared blindingly, and for a moment, everything went silent. The heart of the house. When the light faded, Jonathan found himself standing in a different room. The walls were blackened, charred as though the house had been set aflame long ago. But there was no sign of fire now. The air was thick with a palpable darkness, that hung like a shroud. In the center of the room stood an enormous, pulsing heart, its veins writhing with a sickly black energy. The whispers came again, louder this time, a chorus of voices, each one older and more desperate than the last. You shouldn't have come, but you are here now. We can't let you leave. Jonathan's breath quickened as he took in the sight of the heart. It wasn't just a symbol. It was the house's soul, the very thing that kept it alive, feeding off the souls of the living. It had been alive for centuries, twisting and contorting with the dark energy that flowed through its walls. And now, Jonathan was part of it, a prisoner. The drowned ones had found their way inside. Jonathan could hear their wet, dragging footsteps behind him, closing in on him. They had no faces now, just soulless, empty eyes. Their hands reached out, their fingers clawing toward him, pulling him closer to the pulsing heart, the final descent. As Jonathan turned to face the heart, he felt the floor beneath him tremble. The house was alive. It was waking up completely, and he was the sacrifice. The drowned ones surged forward, their hands wrapping around his legs, dragging him toward the center of the room. He struggled, kicking, clawing at the ground, but the house's power was too great. The whispers had turned into shrill, horrifying screams, all pleading for him to join them. "Help!" Jonathan cried out, but his voice was swallowed by the suffocating darkness. The last thing he saw before the world around him went black was the heart's twisted grin. He had become part of the house, part of its living nightmare. The drowned house remains. No one ever saw Jonathan Gray again. The drowned house continued to stand, waiting for the next curious soul to enter its walls. And those who dared speak of it could never tell the full story. For the house was not simply a building. It was a curse, one that would forever hunger for the souls of those who came too close. The whispers never stopped. They called out from the house, waiting to claim the next victim. And somewhere in the shadows, Jonathan's face could still be seen in the reflection of the mirror, trapped within the heart of the drowned house forever. The house's endless hunger days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The drowned house still stood, ever watchful and relentless in its hunger, yet its presence did not go unnoticed. The town nearby, which had long since abandoned the house after countless rumors and disappearances, had almost forgotten its dark history. Almost. A new group of travelers, curious and unwitting, arrived in the town. They were drawn to the town's eerie silence, the stories of strange happenings, and the whispers that still drifted in the air. They spoke of exploring the old house, seeing what had become of it, but no one in the town dared speak of it openly. The fear that the house invoked was too deep, too terrifying. But they couldn't resist. These explorers, including a group of 3 friends, Eli, Marcus, and Claire, were determined to uncover the secrets of the infamous drowned house. Their excitement masked the unease that had begun to build as they approached the weathered gates. "Let's go in," Eli said, his voice barely more than a whisper, though his hand gripped his flashlight tight. His words were brave, but his eyes darted around the area as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. Marcus, ever the skeptic, shrugged. "It's just a house, guys. All these stories are nothing but old legends. A good adventure, that's all." Claire, more intuitive than the others, hesitated. "I don't know. Something doesn't feel right." But it was too late for hesitation. The door creaked open with a single touch, almost as if the house was waiting for them to arrive. The instant they crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped, and the faint whispers that had been swirling in the town became louder, more urgent, more insistent. Unraveling the past as they stepped inside, The house seemed to shift around them, as if it were welcoming them in, only to trap them. They wandered through its decaying halls, their footsteps echoing unnervingly. Every room felt like it was alive with history. Old paintings that seemed to watch their every move, cracked mirrors that reflected things that weren't there, and walls that seemed to hum with something dark and hidden. Claire felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house was watching them. "Maybe we should leave," she said, but her voice was lost in the oppressive silence. Before they could respond, the house groaned, a low, deep sound that seemed to come from the very walls. The floorboards creaked beneath them, and as they glanced up, they saw a movement. A figure, faint, like a shadow, stood at the far end of the hall, staring at them. "Did you see that?" Claire gasped, grabbing Marcus's arm. Marcus spun around, his flashlight beam darting toward the spot she had pointed to. But there was nothing there. "It's just your imagination," Marcus said, trying to steady his nerves. "Come on, let's explore. We came this far." But Eli was already moving toward the staircase. Something had drawn his attention. An old, ornate mirror at the top of the landing. The surface of the mirror was cracked and fogged, but through the mist, he could make out what appeared to be a faint silhouette. It was a woman, standing just behind the reflection of himself. The image was blurry, but Eli could swear that her eyes were glowing. He stepped closer to the mirror, his heartbeat quickening. He could hear the whispers again, louder now. They were calling to him. The unseen force. Eli reached out and touched the mirror. The instant his fingers brushed the surface, the house seemed to tremble beneath him. The walls seemed to warp, the air thickening around him. The whispers turned to screams, and the lights flickered erratically. "Eli!" Marcus shouted, rushing forward, but it was too late. The moment Eli's hand made contact with the mirror, the house claimed him. A shrill, inhuman cry filled the air as Eli was sucked into the glass, his body convulsed violently, as if being pulled into another dimension. The mirror became a portal, a passage to the very heart of the house. The floor beneath them cracked open, and the walls seemed to pulsate with dark energy. Claire screamed, but Marcus could barely hear her over the sound of Eli's agony. "We need to get out. Now!" They turned and raced toward the door, but it was no longer where it had been. The hallway stretched endlessly, and the windows had disappeared. The house had shifted again, trapping them inside. There was no escape. The heart's call. The house groaned as if it were alive, feeding on their fear, their desperation. The drowned ones began to emerge from the shadows, their bloated forms moving slowly toward the two survivors. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet cracked open, revealing a large pit. At the bottom of the pit lay a grotesque, pulsing heart, its veins stretching throughout the walls and floors of the house. The heart was the very core of the house, its power, its life. It had been feeding on the souls of those who entered, and now it was calling out to Claire and Marcus. Claire backed away in terror, her eyes wide with disbelief. This is impossible." Marcus was frozen, unable to tear his gaze away from the heart. It seemed to beckon them, to pull them closer, as if it wanted to consume them too. "Join us." The whispers echoed in their minds, beckoning them into the darkness, the choice. In the midst of the chaos, Claire grabbed Marcus's arm and pulled him toward a small door at the back of the room. It had been hidden in plain sight, cloaked in darkness. "Run!" she screamed, but Marcus hesitated. torn between the pulsing heart and his desire to survive. The drowned ones closed in, their eyes glowing bright as they dragged their wet, decaying bodies toward them. With a final desperate pull, Claire dragged Marcus through the door. The room behind them slammed shut just as the drowned ones reached it. They ran, blindly, down dark corridors that twisted and turned. It felt like the house had no end, no way out. But Claire held on tight to Marcus, determined not to let the house consume them. But the house wasn't finished with them yet. It was relentless, patient, and it knew they could never truly escape. The end of the line, they ran until they could run no more. The air grew thicker, and the shadows pressed in from all sides. The whispers became screams again, louder than ever, driving them to madness. Claire collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath, her mind unraveling under the weight of the house's dark presence. Suddenly the house fell silent. Everything stopped. The drowned ones appeared before them, their faces now unmistakable, dead, soulless, and yet still somehow human. The house had claimed their souls, and now it would claim theirs. As the drowned ones reached out, Claire whispered, "It's too late. We are its prisoners." And in that moment, the heart of the house pulsed once more, as it had for centuries. The cycle was complete. To this day, the drowned house stands. The town has long since been abandoned, but some still venture close to the ruins. The whispers can still be heard, echoing through the night, and those who listen closely will hear the sound of footsteps, faintly dragging through the mud, and the final cries of those who thought they could escape. But the house is always hungry, always waiting for the next soul to enter, and once it does, the cycle begins again. The house's whispering curse. Years passed since the horrific fate of Claire and Marcus, but the drowned house remained untouched by time. Its cursed walls still stood tall, holding the dark secrets of its past. The town that once surrounded it had withered away into nothingness, forgotten by the world. But the house, with its insatiable hunger, could not be forgotten. One fateful night, another traveler found their way to the outskirts of the town, a man named Jonathan. He had heard the stories of the drowned house from a traveling merchant in a neighboring town. Intrigued, he set out to uncover the truth for himself. Unlike the others before him, Jonathan was a man of science, a skeptic who believed there was a rational explanation for everything. The local people warned him, but he brushed aside their concerns. He would be the one to solve the mystery of the house. Jonathan arrived at the town in the early evening, the sun dipping below the horizon. The eerie silence of the abandoned place struck him immediately. It was unsettling, as though the air itself held a breath of something long dead. He could feel the weight of the history in the air as he approached the overgrown path leading to the house. The first night, with his backpack slung over his shoulder, Jonathan walked up to the rotting front door of the drowned house. He hesitated for a moment, hearing the wind rustling through the trees. But his curiosity overpowered his fear. He pushed the door open, which creaked like 1,000 agonized souls crying out in pain. The darkened hallways greeted him with an unnatural chill. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the faded portraits that lined the walls. He noticed that some of the paintings had eyes that seemed to follow him as he moved past them, though he tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the light. He knew the stories of the drowned house, but he refused to believe in the supernatural. The rational part of his mind told him there had to be a logical explanation for the strange occurrences. Jonathan explored deeper into the house, examining every room with a scientific curiosity. It was a house trapped in time, its furniture covered in a thick layer of dust, the windows shattered, and the floors rotting beneath his feet. But there was an underlying sense of something wrong. It wasn't until he entered the basement that he felt the true presence of the house, the basement's secret. The stairs creaked as Jonathan descended into the darkness. The air grew heavier with each step, and his breath became shallow. He flicked on his flashlight, revealing the large stone walls of the basement. The floor was damp, water pooling in various corners. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that Jonathan couldn't recognize, though they seemed oddly familiar. Suddenly, the beam of his flashlight landed on something unusual, a wooden crate, half submerged in water. It was old, its wood rotting away, but it seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. His heart began to race as he knelt down and tried to open it, his fingers trembling. Inside the crate, there was nothing but a single object, a mirror. It was unlike any mirror Jonathan had ever seen. The frame was made of blackened iron, twisted into grotesque shapes resembling serpents. The glass, though cracked, was unusually smooth. When Jonathan reached out to touch it, a cold, unnatural chill coursed through his hand. As his fingers made contact with the glass, the world around him seemed to warp. The house's hold. Suddenly, the house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath Jonathan shifted violently. He stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering, revealing a shadow moving toward him. The shadow grew, taking the form of a figure. It was a woman, pale, dripping with water, and her eyes were glowing a faint, unsettling red. Jonathan tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. He was rooted to the spot, as if the house itself were holding him in place. The woman's voice, low and mournful, echoed through his mind. "You shouldn't have come here, Jonathan. You're already one of us now." His breath caught in his throat, panic rising in his chest. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The woman's figure grew clearer, her eyes locking onto his with an unnerving intensity. The house was pulling him toward the mirror. Jonathan struggled to break free, his body fighting against an unseen force. But it was futile. The house's power was too great. His vision blurred as the woman's hand reached for his face, her fingers cold as ice. Her touch sent a surge of dark energy through him, and his body convulsed violently. The last thing Jonathan saw was the woman's cold, empty eyes before he was sucked into the mirror. The Drowned One's arrival. In the following weeks, rumors spread of a new soul lost to the drowned house. The town remained silent, its people too afraid to speak. But deep down, they all knew the truth. Jonathan had become another addition to the house's ever-growing collection of lost souls. Meanwhile, in the darkened halls of the house, the drowned ones began to stir once more. The house, with its insatiable hunger, now had another victim to feed on, and it was waiting for more, night after night. The whispers grew louder, and the house began to shift, its walls breathing, its floors moving, as though the building itself was alive. The drowned ones emerged from the shadows, their hollow eyes searching for new souls to claim. The house's hunger could not be sated. The endless cycle. The drowned house had been built on a curse, and its hunger was eternal. No one who entered ever left. The house fed on their fear, on their souls, and it had been doing so for centuries. Every time a new soul entered, it trapped them in a cycle of horror, where they would become part of the house itself, its heart beating in sync with their lost spirits, and so it would continue, forever. The drowned house would stand, its doors ever open to those who dared to uncover its secrets. The souls that entered never truly left. And as for the whispers, they would never cease. They would call out to anyone who dared to listen, promising them answers, but in reality, offering only despair. The house was alive. The unseen hand. Months passed, and the drowned house stood silent, seemingly forgotten by the world. The town that surrounded it had long since vanished, its people replaced by nothing but old rumors and ghost stories. But in the dark corners of the world, there were always those who sought out the forbidden. They didn't believe in curses or ghosts, but rather in the thrill of the unknown. One such individual was Alice, an investigative journalist with a passion for uncovering dark, hidden truths. She had spent years researching haunted locations, debunking myths, and exposing the dark underbelly of the world. However, the story of the drowned house intrigued her in ways that none of the others had. The house wasn't just a haunted building, it was something more. A place where every life that entered was taken, its essence consumed by the house itself. She had to know why. Alice arrived in the town on a cold autumn evening. The air felt heavy, as if it were warning her away. She rented a small cabin near the old woods and prepared herself for the investigation. Armed with her camera, notebook, and a flashlight, she made her way toward the drowned house, determined to uncover its secrets. A new presence. As she stood at the threshold of the house, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The air felt thick, as if something unseen was watching her every move. The moment she touched the door handle, she felt a strange jolt of electricity course through her hand, like a warning. But she brushed it off, believing it to be nothing more than her imagination. The moment she stepped inside, the house seemed to come alive. The walls seemed to pulse, the floor creaked underfoot, and the smell of dampness and rot filled the air. Alice's flashlight flickered in the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift and stretch. The house felt like a living entity, its presence both oppressive and suffocating. Alice took a deep breath and continued her exploration. Her heart raced, but her mind remained focused. The journalist in her refused to believe in the supernatural. There had to be a logical explanation for everything. She entered the basement and immediately felt a wave of unease wash over her. The water on the floor had deepened, almost to her ankles now. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Alice knelt down to examine them closer when she heard it. A soft, faint whisper. It was a voice, but it wasn't human. It was low, guttural, almost unintelligible. It spoke in a language that felt ancient, alien. The voice grew louder, and Alice's flashlight flickered once more. She looked up, and for a moment, everything around her blurred. She saw shadows moving in the corners of her vision, figures that looked almost human, but twisted and wrong. The temperature dropped drastically, and Alice's breath became visible in the air. She shivered as the darkness pressed in on her, but she refused to back down. She had to know the truth, the mirror's dark reflection. Her flashlight suddenly landed on the same crate where Jonathan had discovered the mirror all those years ago. Alice approached it cautiously, her heartbeat quickening. She opened the crate with trembling hands and pulled out the mirror, the cold metal frame chilling her fingers. The mirror felt strangely alive, its glass surface smooth and flawless, despite its apparent age. As Alice stared into the mirror, she felt an overwhelming compulsion to touch it. The reflection in the glass was not her own. Instead, she saw a dark figure, pale and waterlogged, with eyes glowing red. It was Jonathan. He was trapped inside the mirror, his face contorted in a silent scream, his eyes pleading for release. Alice recoiled, dropping the mirror onto the ground. It cracked upon impact, but the figure inside didn't disappear. Instead, the image of Jonathan seemed to grow clearer, more desperate. He reached out through the glass, his hand stretching toward her, his mouth silently mouthing words she could not hear. Suddenly, the whispering voices around her grew louder, more frantic. They surrounded her, echoing in her mind, urging her to join them. "It's your turn," they whispered. "You're next, Alice." Fear gripped her heart, but she refused to succumb to it. She grabbed her camera and began snapping photos of the mirror, hoping to capture something, anything, that could explain the horrors of this place. But with every flash, the figures in the mirror grew closer, and the house seemed to close in on her. The drowned one's return. The ground beneath her feet trembled as the walls of the house shifted once again. The drowned ones were coming. Alice could feel them, their cold, wet presence closing in around her. She turned and saw them, their hollow, dead eyes staring at her from the shadows. Their movements were slow, but deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. And they did. They had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to arrive who was foolish enough to seek the truth. Alice backed toward the stairs, her camera in hand, but she was not quick enough. One of the drowned ones stepped forward, its skeletal hand reaching out to grab her arm. She screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers that filled the room. Suddenly the mirror shattered, and the reflection of the drowned ones leaped out of the glass. The figures in the mirror had come to life, emerging from the broken shards, their forms twisted and monstrous. Alice fought against their grip, struggling to break free, but the house would not let her go. It wanted her, just as it had wanted Jonathan, Claire, and Marcus before her. The drowned ones pulled her into the darkness, their eyes gleaming with hunger. The final whispers. Hours passed, though Alice could no longer tell time. She was lost in a nightmare, trapped in the house's twisted labyrinth. The house had absorbed her soul, and now it was feeding on her fear, her pain, her very essence. The whispers never stopped, growing louder, more insistent. But even in her darkest moments, Alice could hear a faint voice, a voice she hadn't heard in years. It was Jonathan. His voice, weak but desperate, called out to her. "You have to escape. It's too late for me, but not for you." Alice tried to reach out to the voice, but the house tightened its grip, dragging her deeper into the abyss. She could see nothing but darkness, and hear nothing but the whispers. The house was alive, and it would never let her leave. And so the cycle continued. The drowned house would stand, forever awaiting its next victim. Its hunger was insatiable, its thirst unquenchable. The souls of those who entered would remain trapped within, their whispers echoing through the corridors for eternity. The end, for now. Perhaps the house would remain forgotten for a time, but as long as there were those curious enough to uncover its secrets, it would never cease. The drowned house had no end, and neither did the stories that it spawned. The house waited for its next visitor, its next victim, to wander into its dark embrace, and the whispers would continue, calling out forever. The whispering shadows, Alice's mind was clouded, as though something had invaded her thoughts. She was combing through every corner of the mysterious room, her eyes lingering on the windows and corners where the shadows seemed thicker. Her heart raced, as though something invisible was pulling her in, urging her to stay. Suddenly, a whisper echoed through the air, faint but distinct. It was a voice, and it reached Alice's ears like a chilling breeze. She froze, her body tingling with a sensation of unease. The voice was not human, yet not entirely inhuman either. It was ancient, distant, as if carrying the weight of countless centuries. She paused, her eyes darting toward the ceiling, as if something might be lurking above her. The room felt heavier, and she could sense the presence of something watching her, pressing in on her from all sides. Her breath quickened as she felt an unexplainable coldness sweep over her skin. The voice came again, louder this time, but still indistinct. It was as though the very air itself was speaking to her, the house breathing with a voice all its own. This house is yours. Your fate is bound here, the voice murmured, a low, gravelly whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. Alice tried to shake off the sensation, but the more she resisted, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The whisper grew clearer, and this time it seemed to wrap itself around her thoughts. Her eyes widened as she realized that these were not just random echoes. It was speaking directly to her, to the very core of her being. You are a part of this place, Alice. You always have been. Her body froze, and her mind raced to make sense of what she was hearing. She tried to move, to run, but her feet felt as if they were cemented to the floor. The room around her seemed to warp and distort. The shadows stretched longer, pulling her deeper into the house's grasp. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't form. The whispering didn't stop. It became a chorus now, like multiple voices layering over each other, their words indistinguishable, but their intent clear. Alice's mind was unraveling. She tried to recall her reason for coming here, but the more she thought about it, the more it slipped away, like water running through her fingers. In the midst of the chaos, she realized, this house was not just an abandoned, haunted structure. It was alive. It was drawing her in, feeding on her fear, her doubts, her very essence. And now, it had claimed her. The mirror. She had to destroy the mirror. The thought broke through the fog in her mind. The mirror was the key. The final confrontation. With newfound resolve, Alice forced herself to turn away from the whispers, moving back toward the shattered mirror on the floor. She picked up the broken pieces with shaking hands, feeling a strange connection to them. As she touched each shard, she felt the presence of the house pulse around her, as if it were reacting to her every movement. She took a deep breath and, with a trembling hand, held the largest shard up to her face. For a moment, she saw her reflection, but then the mirror began to distort. Her own face seemed to warp, becoming something unfamiliar, something dark. The whispers grew louder, like a storm of voices crashing into her mind. The house was trying to keep her. She could feel it. The house's hunger, its need to trap her soul, just as it had trapped so many before her. You can't escape, Alice, the voices said in unison. We all belong to the house now. But Alice refused to surrender. She smashed the shard into the remaining pieces of the mirror, the moment it shattered completely. A terrible, deafening silence filled the room. The darkness that had swallowed her whole receded, and the house's presence seemed to dissipate, at least for a moment. Alice staggered back, panting, covered in sweat. She had done it. She had destroyed the mirror. But she knew the battle wasn't over. The house wasn't going to let her go that easily. Suddenly, a strange warmth filled the air. Alice looked around, confused. The house, it seemed, was calm. For the first time, she didn't feel its oppressive weight pressing on her. It was as if the house had acknowledged her victory. But Alice wasn't fooling herself. She knew the house could never be defeated completely. It would always wait, always hunger for new souls to claim, and as long as there were people curious enough to enter its depths, it would continue to live. Alice turned toward the door, her mind racing, knowing she couldn't stay. As she stepped outside, she glanced back at the drowned house one last time. Its windows stared back at her like hollow eyes, the house's true nature still hidden beneath its crumbling walls. But the house's grip had loosened on her. For now, at least, she had won. Epilogue. The unseen hand. Though Alice had escaped the clutches of the drowned house, the house's power was far from gone. Stories spread quickly, whispered in dark corners, about the haunted house on the hill. The town continued to forget, but some knew better. Knew that the drowned house still watched, still waited, and every so often, someone would come searching for the truth, unaware of the fate that awaited them. As for Alice, she returned to her life, but the experience never left her. Every night, in the silence of her own home, she would hear a faint whisper in the back of her mind, "You're next." The drowned house had not forgotten her. The return to the house. Years passed, and Alice continued with her life, never truly free from the grip of the drowned house. No matter how far she traveled, the house remained in the back of her mind, a constant, lingering presence. Her dreams were filled with whispers and faces, faces of those who had once been trapped there, faces she could never forget. It haunted her waking hours too. She would see fleeting glimpses of the house in the reflection of windows, in the shadows of unfamiliar rooms. Despite everything, she continued her work as a journalist, but deep down, something gnawed at her, something she could not explain. The house had mocked her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for her, that the story was far from over. One day, as Alice was sorting through her old notes on the house, she stumbled upon something unexpected. An old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, caught her eye. It was an article from years before her arrival, a missing person report about a man named Andrew who had disappeared without a trace near the drowned house. His disappearance had never been solved, and no one had suspected the house. But as Alice read further, her blood ran cold. There was a phrase in the article that caught her attention. "Those who seek the truth of the drowned house are never seen again." It hit her like a lightning bolt. She had forgotten something crucial. The house wasn't simply cursed. It was an entity, an ancient force that consumed souls, one by one. And those who tried to uncover its mysteries were always pulled deeper into its abyss. Her pulse quickened as she recalled the chilling words she'd heard in the basement. "We all belong to the house now. The darkness calls." The house was calling her again, and Alice knew it. She had tried to move on, to forget, but the pull was too strong. It was as if the house had been patiently waiting for her to return. She felt it in her bones now, the undeniable truth. She couldn't escape. The house wasn't finished with her. One cold, grey morning, Alice made her decision. She packed her things and returned to the town, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she would be stepping back into the house's dark embrace. The town seemed different now. Where once it had been quiet and desolate, there was an unsettling presence in the air, a weight that pressed down on her every step. The drowned house loomed in the distance as she made her way to the hill. It was still standing, even though the years had weathered it. The house seemed almost alive, waiting for her. The closer she got, the more she could feel its pull, like an unseen hand grasping at her soul, dragging her toward it. The house awakens as Alice stepped inside. The familiar, cold, musty air wrapped around her like a shroud. The house had changed. Or perhaps it was her perception of it that had altered. The walls seemed to close in on her, the darkness more oppressive, the silence heavier. She wasn't alone this time. The whispers started immediately, louder this time, filling her mind. They came from all directions, echoing through the walls, crawling into her thoughts. But this time, she was ready. She had learned the hard way that the house fed on fear, on doubt. She wouldn't give it that satisfaction again. As she descended into the basement, the temperature dropped, and she could feel the eyes of the house on her, watching her every move. The broken mirror was still there, but it was no longer just a simple object. It was a gateway, a portal to something darker, something more sinister. And then she saw it, the figure of a man standing in front of the mirror. It was Andrew, the missing man from the newspaper article. His eyes were wide, hollow, his skin pale and stretched over his bones. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his gaze was fixed on Alice, full of despair and warning. She reached out for the mirror, her hand trembling. She needed answers. She needed to know how to break the curse, how to free herself from the house's grip, once and for all. The final secret. As Alice's fingers brushed against the mirror's cold surface, something shifted. The air grew heavy, and the room began to spin. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind until it felt as if her very thoughts were being torn apart. A flash of light erupted from the mirror, blinding her. She stumbled back, and when her vision cleared, she found herself in a place she did not recognize, an endless, dark void. She was standing in the middle of an abyss, surrounded by the echoes of lost souls. There were figures here, people who had once lived, now twisted and broken by the house's hunger. Their eyes followed her, their silent pleas reaching out to her. Andrew appeared again, but this time he was different. His body was gaunt, his face a hollow mask of torment. He reached out to her, his eyes filled with terror. "The house, it never lets go," he whispered. "It feeds on us, on our fear, our regrets. You can never escape." Alice felt the weight of his words settle into her chest. She had always known that the house had a power beyond understanding, but this was more than just a house. It was a prison, a place that consumed everything, every soul that dared enter. And now she was trapped with the others. The shadows began to close in around her, their cold, clammy hands reaching out, pulling her deeper into the darkness. Alice screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the abyss. There was no escape. The house had claimed her. Epilogue. The endless cycle. The drowned house stood silent once again, its secrets intact, its hunger sated, at least for now. Those who dared to speak of it were either silenced or driven mad by the horror of what they had seen. But the house would wait, as it always did, for the next soul brave, or foolish, enough to seek its truth. And when that soul arrived, it would be welcomed into the dark fold trapped forever in the endless cycle of the drowned house. And so, the whispers continued, forever echoing through the walls.